Welcome back. Last week we spent quite a lot of time looking at the inauguration of King Lobengula. What an amazing ceremony. Pomp, ceremony, circumstances, everything that the British would have loved to have emulated, I'm sure. And just imagining all the Matabele warriors running from Bulawayo to Chilocho to fetch their new king. All his family ululating and lamenting the fact that they had to give him up. All of the warriors forming this great big semicircle, which was at least a mile wide, about 7,000 to 8,000 people. And then after Uchwalala had given the final words of exactly what was going to be promised by the king in the new reign, then King Lobengula emerged from his family on horseback, galloped straight at the lines of warriors, then wheeled round and bid them farewell before galloping off with his retinue of other horsemen to take him back to Bulawayo. 24 hours of solitude before any feasting took place, during which time he emerged as the spiritual leader of the Matabele. After that, the festivities and the feastings took place. 60 pure black king's cattle slaughtered for the feastings, 10 days of feasting, and then 3 months of complete isolation from his family, with only his sister, Nina, for company. Amazing, really, and as such a lot went into it, so much importance and so much learning for a man who never wanted to be king, and a man who knew better than anybody else exactly what stood in front of him. So we've had a look at that. Well, that all took place at almost simultaneously. You got this Rider Haggard story, King Solomon's Mines, and the gold rushes in Australia, the gold rushes in South Africa, the gold rushes in Canada. There had to be another one which was even bigger than that. That was promised by Sheba's breasts and this incredible, mythical, fictional story of King Solomon's Mines. But a German by the name of Karl Marsch was determined to find them. And off he set, and he somehow got through the border and went off exploring, and he heard about this ruined African city somewhere over there. Not a couple of months later, underneath a mass of creepers and lianas, he discovered Great Zimbabwe. What an extraordinary process that must have been for him, to find these meticulously built granite walls, meticulous stone cutting of granite, walls 6 meters thick, rising up to 10 to 12 meters high. Extraordinary. And the Zimbabwe birds positioned in amongst them. He must have been quite certain that this was the great mythical city. And, of course, they now track the date to that of about 900 AD. And they say, them, what are experts, say that the demise was around the 15th century. Why? Why did it go into ruins? What caused that civilization to disperse? Wouldn't it be great to know instead of to guess what happened in those days? So there you were. Those were all the factors that were coming in, that were pressuring poor old King Lobengula. By this stage, Robert Moffat's son John was in charge of a Nyati mission. And John went and spoke often to King Lobengula. And he said, look, you really need to have some important legal documents and notices and appointments made. Now, one of the people that King Mzilikazi had trusted to act as his sort of gatekeeper of people coming into the country was a man called John Lee. He was probably the first non-missionary to enter the country, and he lived in Mangwe. And so, as King Lobengula had trusted him completely, King Mzilikazi had trusted him completely, King Lobengula decided this was the man he would like to trust as well. And so John Moffat helped to draw up a letter which said, "To my trusted friend John Lee of Mangwe River, Matabeleland, I, Lobengula, hereditary and elected king of the Matabele nation, knowing the esteem and friendship with which you were regarded by my late father Mzilikazi, do hereby appoint you to be my lawful officer and agent in the southern boundary of my kingdom, to receive all applications of my kingdom from travellers, hunters, traders, or other persons desirous of entering my country, and to grant or withhold permission according to my instructions now given or hereafter to be given to you from time to time." And he'd made a very good choice in John Lee, because John Lee was a tough character and he was not going to let a single person into the country if he possibly could. Sometimes it didn't quite work like that. But he did have a little help in the shape of another man, well known today by the name of Thomas Baynes. Now, Baynes was very famous in our eyes for painting those wonderful series of Victoria Falls pictures, but of course he was also painting in other colonies around the world as well. But while he was there, he designed, it is thought, a little stamp with a little elephant on it, the bull elephant of King Lobengula, to be his stamp on all official notices. And it was a very legal and important document because, however John Lee tried, they were sneaking round the back. The gold-hungry men, they'd sneak back across the Zambezi, they'd cross into the country farther up on the western border from Bechuanaland, or, to King Lobengula's absolute fury, they came in through the east coast and negotiated with those itinerant Mashona chiefs whom he did not respect. So despite his best attempts, the king's capital was quickly surrounded by restless men and a spreading camp of villains and adventurers. Some were honest traders, a few were even genuine adventurers, but among them there were absolute criminals and an overwhelming number of profiteers and carpetbaggers. With time, the number of disgruntled and disappointed drunks increased. The Matabele sun was burning, and they would spend months there before Lobengula would agree to see them. The devil found plenty of work for idle hands to do. They swapped increasingly lurid stories about anybody who was granted a concession, undermining, tearing them apart, and trying to manipulate themselves into a key role. In fact, lying and manipulation became almost mandatory for survival. All travellers, hunters, or traders wishing to enter Matabeleland are requested to come to Manyamis, was the next notice, where they will report themselves as usual and obtain permission to come to the king's residence and receive their respective licenses. The hunter's fee for the districts south and west of the Shashi River will be 1 gun of the value of £15 British sterling, 1 5-pound bag of powder, 2 6-pound bars of lead, and 1 bag of 500 caps, presumably for the guns. No occupation of the country is allowed, nor any houses to be built except by the king's special permission, given at the town of Gipetegu, 11th of April, 1870. Lobengula, signed with his X mark and elephant seal, King of the Matabele nation. So, as a further deterrent, he was demanding payment for anybody who wanted to come into the country, and rightly so too. But the old Mashonas kept undermining him. The other interesting thing is Lobengula knew that he needed guns. The whole reason why he didn't have guns was because King Khama, being terrified of the Matabele people, and had been for ages, so generationally, as the Mfecane came closer and closer to Bechuanaland, King Khama went to the British and said, "We must have a law that no tribe is allowed to have guns. So the British enacted that law, but of course it didn't last. And it wasn't long before the Boers were handing guns over to certain tribes, etc., etc. And so Lobengula himself was able to dictate that anybody who wanted to come into the country had to pay him in guns, a forerunner of the Rudd concession, which we will deal with next week. So how did the king discipline a force of 20,000 people? Naturally, there was a military discipline in amongst everything they did. Everything was in regiments and chiefs. It was magnificently organised, but there were always renegades somewhere. So how on earth would he discipline anybody? Well, there's one example of it. One man dared to taste the king's beer. That was not done, ever. Lobengula ordered his nose cut off because it had smelt the king's beer. Next, his lips, because they had tasted the king's beer. Then his ears, because he had heard no one must hear about the king's beer. And then his eyes, because they had seen the king's beer. In my book, I'm able to use one of the characters to say, oh, they didn't poke his eyes out, did they? No, they didn't poke his eyes out. They skinned his forehead, allowing the skin to hang down so he couldn't see. Then they thrashed him. The missionary who recorded this wrote, the poor wretch dragged himself to the river, coming right past my wagon, and you never saw such a ghastly sight. Ghastly, but what alternatives did he have? I mean, at one time later on, the missionary was trying to persuade him to put his people into jail. Lobengula laughed. He said, now come on, this is ridiculous. Put those people in jail. Your jail gives them a house to sleep in, a blanket to lie on, and food to eat. If I build a jail, I'd have the whole Matabele nation in there in 1 week. Not an option. Not an option. So I think it is important to understand who he was, how he managed his life, and how he was helped to manage his life. Because Lobengula would not put his X on any paper unless there was a missionary there to corroborate and watch him signing it and to sign himself that it had been done. In turn, the British government would accept no document purported to be from the king unless there was a missionary's signature on it against his X as verification and Lobengula's elephant stamp. So these were just some of the safeguards that had to be taken in order for the king to actually survive this onslaught of people coming through. So what sort of man was he? Well, a man called Henry Starb wrote, and he said, King Lobengula was at least a century ahead of his people, a far-seeing, clever man, and like most Zulus, a clever disputant. So good at arguing, good at foreseeing outcomes, good at understanding. Charles Helm, who was a missionary that was very close to Lobengula, talked of the king's frequent demands for his presence and occasionally for that of his wife and children. He described how the children would dress up in their best clothes and take presents for the king. One would bring an egg, or perhaps a newly hatched chicken, and others some beans from their garden. They learned from a very young age that they must enter, bent at the waist, on the left-hand side, and look the king in the eye all the time, praising him and saying pleasant things in English. He liked to hear the children's voices. They in turn would have learnt Sindebele very quickly. They'd have to sit down, making sure their heads were always lower than the king's, as they weren't allowed to stand up unless the king stood up as well. When he gave the signal, then he would receive their presents. The king would roar with laughter as to see those presents and to receive them, and the children just kept giving him more presents to hear him laugh. Then he'd give them a very big smile. The Helms had many children, and each new baby was presented as a courtesy to Lobengula to be inspected. This he did with great solemnity and would declare the new addition to be healthy and strong. He was a leader, this man. There's no question. He was an intelligent leader of his people. At times, he must have spoken with bitterness in his heart about certain things. Bitterness about the white people. But hanging over all of it, he had this dictate from King Mzilikazi that said, as far as the missionaries were concerned, these vessels are not to be broken. And it was something King Lobengula bore in mind, and he never, ever let them down, the missionaries. In fact, the missionaries told Lobengula about God and salvation and how bringing the Matabele people to faith was important. Lobengula would listen intently. Then he said, this is a measure of the man, he felt God had designed each nation exactly as he wished and intended it to remain. He said the white men were skilled in work, the black with plenty of good cattle and accustomed to making raids and war. And then, and this was interesting and sad, he said if the black man was meant to do the same things as the white, it was unfair that God had not told them how to do it. So, obviously, there was conflict all over the place. But I have found it distressing to find how many times now in Zimbabwe, the Africans in Zimbabwe often downgrade Lobengula. They say he gave the country away. No, he did not. He was absolutely determined to do his best for the people, but the pressures were getting so great, it was almost impossible. Those pressures came from Belgians, Portuguese, Germans, French, Voortrekkers, and the British. All of them trying desperately to get this last little bit, which could be King Solomon's mines, which could have great wealth for them. They didn't care too much about the people who were already there. Then we get to the Rudd concession. Now, I'll talk about this in more next week because it's a tremendously important part of that history. And it is full of all sorts of anomalies. It deserves a whole podcast of its own. Just to give you some idea of how difficult things were, in a chapter where we have worked on the Rudd Commission, Rudd concession with these 4 characters in my book, this will just give you a bit of an idea of how that last chapter unfolds. Somebody or 2 somebodies were given a copy of the concession. The original document was hidden in a pumpkin gourd by somebody and an ant-bear hole by somebody else. And to cap it all, Jabu said scornfully, 2 stupid people tried to cross the Bechuanaland Desert in October, the hottest month of the year before the rains come. Crazy. They were only now beginning to understand the frustration of trying to arrive at something near the truth. We'll find out that something near the truth. You can make up your own minds this time next week. Thank you for listening.